Captured on foreign soil, Major Alexei Komolov insists he was merely following orders. He presents himself as a dutiful soldier, caught in circumstances beyond his control. But beneath the surface of his carefully chosen words lies a far darker story, one of moral ambiguity, responsibility, and the devastating consequences of war. Born in the quiet Russian city of Penza in 1978, Alexei grew up in a military family steeped in tradition and discipline. Following in his father's footsteps, he dedicated his early career to the Ministry of Emergency Situations, a role that seemed focused on protecting lives and rebuilding communities. But this path took a sharp and troubling turn. By 2022, he found himself in Ukraine, not as a rescuer, but as an invader. A man who once spoke of saving lives now stood accused of destroying them. Alexei claims his role in the war was passive. He insists that his deployment was not by choice but by obligation, the result of a state-driven mobilization that left him with no alternatives. And yet, his position as a reconnaissance officer in the Russian army places him squarely in the machinery of occupation. His unit operated in Ukrainian territories, their movements calculated to maintain control over stolen land. The facade of reluctant duty starts to crumble when faced with the sheer scale of the destruction left in his wake. Captured near Bakhmut in May 2023, Alexei recounts the moments leading to his surrender with a veneer of calm. He describes leaving his unit behind to reduce risk, walking alone with only his rifle in hand. His words, however, betray an officer who chose isolation over leadership, a man who walked willingly into the arms of his captors to escape the inevitable collapse of his position. To Alexei, his surrender was a strategy. To his Ukrainian captors, it was justice. In his own account, Alexei portrays himself as a victim of circumstance, a man swept up in the tides of war, bound by the orders of his superiors. But the context of his deployment tells a different story. His presence in occupied territories like Kherson and Bakhmut aligns with Russia's larger campaign of devastation. Towns reduced to rubble, lives displaced, and rivers polluted with the remnants of war. One incident stands out above the rest, the destruction of the Kakhovka Dam. The catastrophe submerged entire communities, leaving thousands homeless and many dead. Alexei denies direct involvement but admits to hearing of its devastation. The question lingers: how much did he truly know, and how much was he complicit? Through his interview, Alexei's narrative is shaped by omissions and contradictions. He repeatedly asserts his humanity, but when asked about his role in the war's atrocities, his answers are vague, evasive, and often contradictory. When confronted with evidence of Russian forces targeting civilians during evacuations, his defense falters. He speaks of orders and inevitabilities but offers no acknowledgement of personal accountability. As the interviewer presses, Alexei's calm exterior begins to crack. This is a story of a man at war, not only with a foreign land but also with himself. His words reveal an internal conflict, a desperate attempt to reconcile the image of a soldier with the reality of an occupier. He grapples with questions of morality and survival, trying to justify his choices even as the weight of evidence mounts against him. Alexei Komolov's tale is not just about one man's actions in the chaos of war. It is about the consequences of blind obedience, the erosion of humanity, and the haunting legacy of those who follow orders without question. In the coming chapters, we'll dive deeper into Alexei's life, his actions, and the truths he would rather leave untold. What drove this man from the safety of Penza to the ruins of Bakhmut? How did a rescuer become a participant in destruction? And what does his story reveal about the choices we make when morality collides with survival? This is the story of Major Alexei Komolov, a man whose war is far from over. Stay with us. Alexei Komolov was born on November 5, 1978, in the industrial city of Penza, a place where the rhythm of life was dictated by the military and the hum of factories. His family, deeply rooted in military tradition, instilled in him a sense of duty and discipline from an early age. His father, a stern and proud officer in the Soviet armed forces, was a man of unwavering loyalty to his country. For Alexei, growing up in a household shaped by such rigid expectations left little room for deviation. Penza itself mirrored the values of his family, a city defined by its role in supporting the Soviet military-industrial complex. Streets bore the names of war heroes, and children were raised to admire the stoic faces of men in uniform. It was an environment that molded Alexei's identity. He spent his youth listening to his father's stories of service and sacrifice, internalizing the belief that to serve was to find purpose. Alexei excelled in school, though his path was never truly his own. The family's military lineage cast a long shadow, leaving him with little choice but to follow in the footsteps of those who came before him. It was an unspoken rule that Komolov men would dedicate their lives to the state. Yet, Alexei's childhood was not entirely devoid of personal interests. He loved sports, especially football, and took pride in moments of camaraderie with friends. These glimpses of individuality were, however, fleeting, eclipsed by the weight of familial expectations. His decision to attend the Penza Military Engineering Academy after high school was not surprising to those who knew him. For Alexei, it seemed less like a choice and more like a destiny handed down through generations. His enrollment marked the beginning of a life committed to uniformed service, one that would take him from the sheltered confines of Penza to far more turbulent front lines. Despite the strict upbringing, Alexei's early years were not without moments of normalcy. His mother, a schoolteacher, balanced the rigidity of his father's discipline with warmth and encouragement. She taught him the value of empathy and intellect, traits that, as the years would show, would struggle to coexist with his role as a soldier. Penza offered Alexei a safe and predictable life, a stark contrast to the chaos he would one day encounter. As Alexei grew, the Soviet Union began to unravel, and with it, the certainty of a path well trodden by his ancestors. The dissolution of the USSR in the early 1990s brought with it a wave of uncertainty, but for the Komolov family, the mission remained unchanged, loyalty to the state above all else. Alexei's upbringing was a reflection of this creed, setting the stage for a man who would later wrestle with the complexities of duty, morality, and the choices imposed upon him by a nation at war. It was in these formative years that the foundation of Alexei Komolov was built, a man defined by duty, shaped by discipline, and burdened by expectations. Yet, as history would unfold, the values instilled in him as a child would collide with the grim realities of war, forcing him to confront what it truly means to serve. In 2001, Alexei Komolov began what he believed would be a career of service and purpose. Joining the Ministry of Emergency Situations, or MTA-8s, he stepped into a role that seemed to align with the values instilled in him during his upbringing. As an officer, Alexei's work revolved around disaster response, rescuing civilians from life-threatening situations, and rebuilding communities struck by tragedy. It was a role that appeared noble on the surface, a man in uniform saving lives rather than taking them. His early years in the MTHS were marked by commendable achievements. Alexei rose quickly through the ranks, becoming a respected leader within his unit. He supervised teams conducting hazardous rescue operations, including responding to a gas explosion in a residential building in the city of Vyborg, an event that left parts of the structure reduced to rubble. He later described this moment as one of the most harrowing in his career, a testament to his resolve and leadership under pressure. Yet, even during these years of service, cracks in Alexei's narrative began to emerge. While he presented himself as a hero committed to safeguarding lives, his career in MCHS was not without controversy. Some colleagues described him as a man driven more by ambition than altruism, a leader who often distanced himself from the more dangerous aspects of rescue operations, delegating risks to his subordinates. Alexei's work at MPHS provided him with an intimate understanding of destruction, an expertise he would later carry into Ukraine, though in a far different capacity. The tools and strategies he once used to save lives were repurposed as part of an occupying force, where the priorities shifted from protection to control. He supervised the maintenance of military logistics and operations in occupied territories, demonstrating a grim transformation from rescuer to enforcer. The contrast between Alexei's narrative and his actions during the war is stark. In interviews, he speaks of his time in MTHS with pride, emphasizing his dedication to serving the public. Yet, the war in Ukraine revealed a different side of him. Villages and towns were reduced to ruins, bridges were destroyed, and thousands of civilians were displaced under his watch. It was a far cry from the ideals he claimed to uphold during his time in MCHS. For Alexei, the shift from saving lives to participating in their destruction is a moral contradiction he struggles to reconcile. When pressed during his interrogation, he is quick to deflect responsibility, attributing his role in Ukraine to orders from above. He clings to the image of himself as a man of service, a narrative that grows increasingly hollow against the backdrop of war. The years Alexei spent at MJS were formative, shaping him into the disciplined officer who would later lead troops into Ukrainian territory. Yet, they also highlight the duality of his character. A man capable of both building and destroying, rescuing and occupying. His early career was a prelude to the complexities that would define his role in the war, raising the question of whether his transformation was the result of circumstance or choice. In 2010, Alexei Komolov's career took a decisive turn. His time with the Ministry of Emergency Situations ended amid organizational restructuring, and he found himself at a crossroads. By February 2011, he had transitioned into a role with Russia's internal troops, a precursor to the modern-day National Guard. This shift marked the beginning of a new chapter, one defined less by public service and more by militarized discipline and control. It was a path that would ultimately lead him to the front lines of an unjust war. Initially stationed in Saratov, Alexei served as a senior staff officer in training regiment. On paper, the role appeared administrative, focusing on logistical coordination and tactical planning. But the internal troops were not just about maintaining order. They were instruments of state power, tasked with suppressing dissent and enforcing authority. It was here that Alexei began to witness the blurred lines between service and subjugation, a moral ambiguity that would later dominate his actions in Ukraine. This transition from MPAS to the military brought Alexei into an environment where loyalty to the state took precedence over all else. The camaraderie and purpose he once found in rescue operations were replaced by the rigid hierarchy of a military structure. Orders were followed without question, and dissent was not an option. Alexei excelled in this system, quickly proving himself capable of managing complex operations and commanding respect from subordinates. Yet, it was also in this environment that his personal agency began to erode, as he learned to prioritize obedience over morality. After a brief tenure with the internal troops, Alexei moved to roles that increasingly placed him closer to combat. By 2022, he was mobilized into the Russian armed forces, a move he later described as one without choice or alternative. Assigned to a reconnaissance unit, Alexei's responsibilities expanded beyond logistical support to include active participation in the war effort. He was now leading missions into hostile territory, gathering intelligence, and coordinating movements that directly contributed to the occupation of Ukrainian land. In his interview, Alexei portrays this transition as inevitable, a duty imposed upon him by the state. But the reality of his actions tells a different story. Under his leadership, reconnaissance missions paved the way for destructive campaigns. His unit's operations were not passive. They actively facilitated the dismantling of communities, clearing the path for the larger machinery of war to take hold. Villages were emptied, homes were abandoned, and the scars of occupation were etched deeply into the landscape. Alexei's insistence that he was simply following orders does little to mask the moral weight of these actions. Moments of moral ambiguity pepper his account. He describes instances where he faced difficult choices, whether to risk his men's lives or retreat, whether to report civilian resistance or look the other way. Yet, when pressed, Alexei consistently defaults to a narrative of inevitability, refusing to accept full responsibility for the outcomes of his decisions. His moral compass, once aligned with saving lives in the MCHS, seemed to falter in the face of war's relentless demands. The transition from a rescuer to a combatant was gradual, but it was also transformative. It revealed the fragility of Alexei's principles when tested against the pressures of obedience and survival. His role in the military highlights the complexities of war, where the lines between right and wrong blur, and the choices made in moments of tension can define a legacy. For Alexei Komolov, that legacy is one of contradiction. A man who once sought to save lives, now grappling with the destruction left in his wake. In early 2022, Alexei Komolov received the orders that would irrevocably alter the course of his life. Deployed to Ukraine as part of the Russian military's ongoing special operation, he was tasked with leading a reconnaissance unit in territories under Russian control. For Alexei, the mission was framed as a duty to his country, a campaign to protect Russian-speaking populations and secure borders. Yet, the reality he encountered in Ukraine was far more complex, marked by destruction, resistance, and the unmistakable stain of occupation. Alexei's initial deployment brought him to Kherson, one of the first major cities seized by Russian forces. As he entered the city, Alexei recalls a scene of eerie quiet, shops shuttered, streets empty, and the air thick with tension. The official narrative he carried with him painted Russian soldiers as liberators, welcomed by grateful civilians. But the cold stares from residents peering through half-closed curtains told a different story. While Alexei denies being an occupier, his presence in Kherson, his patrols, his checkpoints, his oversight of logistics, embodied the very essence of occupation. From Kherson, His unit moved deeper into Ukrainian territory, establishing reconnaissance outposts and securing supply lines. Alexei insists that his role was limited to gathering intelligence and ensuring operational efficiency, tasks he describes as necessary and non-violent. But these operations were anything but neutral. Reconnaissance missions often targeted critical infrastructure, clearing paths for Russian forces to advance. Bridges were demolished, roads were mined, and civilians fleeing conflict zones were frequently caught in the crossfire. When asked about his presence in Ukraine, Alexei deflects, insisting he was simply following orders. He emphasizes that he had no hand in the broader strategy, portraying himself as a cog in the machine, powerless to alter its course. Yet, his position as a reconnaissance officer afforded him knowledge and influence that went beyond mere compliance. His unit's intelligence reports played a direct role in shaping operations that displaced thousands of Ukrainians from their homes. In interviews, Alexei clings to a narrative of moral distance. He speaks of his reluctance to engage with local populations, framing this avoidance as a sign of respect rather than fear of confrontation. He recounts moments where he ordered his men to give food and water to displaced civilians, gestures he cites as proof of his humanity. But these isolated acts of kindness stand in stark contrast to the broader devastation surrounding him. Devastation enabled, in no small part, by the reconnaissance missions he led. One of the starkest contradictions in Alexei's story emerges when discussing his awareness of atrocities committed by Russian forces. He claims to have heard rumors of civilian casualties and looting, but denies any direct involvement. When pressed on his unit's role in identifying resistance hotspots, areas that were later shelled by Russian artillery, he falters, offering vague explanations about the chain of command. It is here that Alexei's narrative begins to unravel, exposing the moral dissonance of a man who refuses to see himself as part of the system he served. Despite his denials, Alexei's deployment in Ukraine was marked by actions that left an indelible mark on the occupied territories. His unit's presence brought not stability but fear. Their operations dismantled communities rather than protecting them. For the civilians in Kherson, Melitopol, and other towns his unit passed through, Alexei was not a liberator. He was a symbol of invasion, a foreign soldier enforcing the will of a regime that sought to erase their sovereignty. As Alexei recounts his entry into Ukraine, he speaks with a tone of detachment, as if the events around him were beyond his control. But the evidence tells a different story, one of complicity, of choices made, and of consequences ignored. His insistence that he was not an occupier rings hollow against the backdrop of his actions, leaving a question that lingers long after the words fade. How does a man reconcile his role in a war he claims not to believe in? For Alexei Komolov, the answer remains elusive. The story of Major Alexei Komolov's role in Ukraine takes a darker turn when examining the aftermath of his unit's operations. Despite his efforts to portray himself as an unwilling participant, the evidence of destruction and devastation tied to his actions is undeniable. Nowhere is this more evident than in the events surrounding the destruction of the Kakhovka Dam, a catastrophe that would forever alter the lives of thousands and leave a lasting scar on the region. Alexei's reconnaissance unit was active in the area surrounding the Kakhovka hydroelectric station in the months leading up to the dam's destruction. Officially, his unit's mission was to monitor Ukrainian resistance and ensure the security of Russian supply lines. However, Alexei acknowledges that intelligence gathered by his team played a key role in the region's strategic planning. Reports from his unit highlighted potential threats to Russian control of the area, marking civilian evacuation routes, infrastructure hubs, and sites of Ukrainian resistance. When the dam was destroyed in June 2023, the resulting flood submerged entire villages, forced thousands from their homes, and claimed numerous lives. Alexei denies any direct involvement, claiming that his unit had left the area weeks before the incident. But when pressed, his answers grow evasive. He acknowledges that discussions about neutralizing critical infrastructure were common among higher command. And though he insists he was not privy to specific plans, his intelligence reports would have informed these decisions. The destruction of the dam exemplifies the larger pattern of devastation left in the wake of Alexei's operations. His unit's reconnaissance missions targeted more than just resistance fighters. They often focused on critical civilian infrastructure. In one account from the interview, Alexei describes a mission in which his team identified a bridge used by both Ukrainian military and civilian refugees fleeing conflict zones. Days later, the bridge was destroyed in an airstrike, cutting off a vital escape route. When confronted with this, Alexei deflects, claiming it was not his role to determine the targets of military strikes. Yet, His reconnaissance provided the coordinates that made such decisions possible. Another chilling example of his unit's impact came during their deployment in Melitopol. Alexei recounts how his team was tasked with surveying a local industrial zone suspected of housing Ukrainian resistance fighters. While he insists their focus was purely on intelligence gathering, the aftermath tells a different story. Within days of his report, the area was shelled heavily by Russian artillery. Factories, warehouses, and residential blocks were leveled. Civilians caught in the area were killed or wounded, and those who survived were left with nothing but rubble. Throughout the interview, Alexei attempts to distance himself from these outcomes, painting himself as a man trapped in a system beyond his control. He describes the guilt he felt when learning of the destruction, though he stops short of acknowledging his role in enabling it. "It wasn't my decision," he says repeatedly, as if absolution lies in the chain of command. But his intelligence reports, his presence in occupied zones, and his leadership of missions that directly facilitated such devastation tell a different story. The interviewer's probing reveals even more contradictions in Alexei's account. He claims to have witnessed moments of humanity during these operations, such as offering food to displaced civilians or ensuring safe passage for families caught in crossfire. Yet, these anecdotes stand in stark contrast to the larger picture of chaos and suffering left in his wake. The destruction of the Kakhovka Dam, the targeting of civilian escape routes, and the shelling of Melitopol all point to a reality far removed from the compassionate narrative Alexei tries to weave. What emerges is a portrait of a man struggling to reconcile his actions with his sense of self. Alexei Komolov insists he was following orders, but the devastation tied to his unit's operations suggests a deeper complicity. As the floodwaters of Kakhovka receded, they revealed not only the physical wreckage but also the moral consequences of Alexei's decisions. And while he may claim ignorance or helplessness, the evidence of destruction remains, etched into the landscape of Ukraine and the lives of those who endured it. Alexei Komolov sits upright, his posture rigid, as if maintaining military discipline even in captivity. His tone is calm, measured, as he begins to explain his actions during the war. "I was following orders," he states, the refrain of countless soldiers across history. For Alexei, this justification is both shield and sword, a defense against accusations and a tool to assert his innocence. Yet, as the interviewer presses deeper, this veneer begins to crack, revealing the contradictions and moral dissonance that lie beneath. When asked about his role in the reconnaissance missions that led to the destruction of civilian infrastructure, Alexei deflects. "Our job was intelligence gathering," he explains, his words carefully chosen. "We didn't make decisions about targets or strikes. That was up to command. To him, his position absolves him of responsibility." He emphasizes the chain of command, a structure he claims left him powerless to influence outcomes. But the interviewer's response cuts through this narrative. "You provided the coordinates. Without your reports, those strikes would not have been possible." Caught off guard, Alexei shifts his argument. "I didn't know they would target civilian areas," he insists. "We were told these were legitimate military objectives." The interviewer counters with evidence, maps marked by his unit, areas of dual-use infrastructure like bridges and industrial zones. These sites were used by civilians and refugees, the interviewer points out. "Didn't you think about the consequences of marking them for strikes?" There is a pause, a brief flicker of emotion crossing Alexei's face. "We didn't have time to think," he says, his voice lower now. "The situation was chaotic. Decisions had to be made quickly. We trusted the information given to us. Yet, the trust he speaks of is precisely what the interviewer challenges. Isn't that the problem?" The interviewer asks. Blind trust in orders without questioning their morality. The conversation turns to the destruction of the Kakhovka Dam. Alexei denies direct involvement, repeating that his unit had left the area weeks prior. "I heard about it later, like everyone else," he claims. "I was shocked by the scale of what happened." But the interviewer does not relent. "Your unit's intelligence reports included assessments of the dam's strategic importance," they point out. "You must have known it was a potential target." Alexei shifts uncomfortably in his seat. "I assumed it was for defense," he replies, his voice wavering slightly. To prevent enemy advances, the interviewer leans forward, their tone sharp. "Defense? The flood displaced thousands of civilians, destroyed homes, and killed many. How is that defense?" The contradictions become more apparent as Alexei continues to rationalize his actions. He speaks of his duty to protect his men, of ensuring their survival in an environment where mistakes could mean death. "I had a responsibility to my unit," he says, almost pleading. "I couldn't afford to question every order. My focus was on keeping my men alive." But the interviewer seizes on this. questioning whether the survival of his soldiers justified the harm inflicted on civilians. "Does following orders absolve you of moral responsibility?" they ask. "Does protecting your men justify destroying the lives of others?" Alexei struggles to answer. His justifications, once delivered with confidence, now falter under scrutiny. He speaks of fear, of a system where questioning orders was not only discouraged but punished. "You don't understand what it's like," he says finally. "If I had refused, it wouldn't have changed anything. Someone else would have done it, and I'd have been court-martialed." The interviewer's final question hangs in the air, heavy with implication. And does that make it right? Does that make it any less your responsibility? Alexei does not respond immediately. His silence speaks volumes, a rare moment of vulnerability in an otherwise controlled performance. What emerges from this exchange is a portrait of a man trapped between duty and morality, a soldier who clings to the chain of command as a lifeline even as it drags him deeper into culpability. Alexei Komolov's rationalizations reveal not just his struggle to justify his actions to others, but also to himself. And in his attempts to absolve his conscience, he inadvertently exposes the moral void at the heart of his narrative, a void that no justification can fill. The fields near Bakhmut were cloaked in a tense stillness, broken only by the distant rumble of artillery and the sharp, intermittent crack of gunfire. Major Alexei Komolov, crouched in a shallow ditch, clutched his rifle tightly as he scanned the horizon. His reconnaissance unit, fragmented after weeks of relentless skirmishes, had scattered into smaller groups to avoid detection. Supplies were running low, morale was crumbling, and the weight of the war now bore down heavily on every decision. It was May 2023, and the battle for Bakhmut had reached its boiling point. Ukrainian forces had launched a series of counteroffensives, pushing Russian troops back inch by inch. Alexei's unit, tasked with providing intelligence on troop movements, found itself trapped between advancing Ukrainian soldiers and the diminishing support from their own command. Communications were sparse, and reinforcements were nowhere to be found. For Alexei, the mission had shifted from reconnaissance to survival. That morning, Alexei had ordered his men to split into pairs and retreat towards the east, hoping to regroup behind Russian lines. "Stick to the tree lines," he instructed, his voice steady despite the chaos surrounding them. "Minimize your exposure and move only at dawn or dusk." These were the orders of a man trying to maintain control, but deep down, Alexei knew the odds were stacked against them. As the major, he stayed behind, planning to scout an escape route before following the last group. He thought he was minimizing risk for his men, but in truth, he was isolating himself from the inevitable collapse of his unit. By late afternoon, Alexei was alone, moving cautiously through the dense underbrush near the outskirts of Bakhmut. He had discarded his radio to avoid detection, leaving him cut off from both his men and his command. Hunger gnawed at him, and fatigue dulled his senses, but he pressed on, guided by the hope of finding a way out. Each step felt heavier than the last, and each moment of hesitation allowed the shadows of doubt to creep in. It was during one of these pauses, as he crouched near a cluster of ruined buildings, that he first spotted them. Ukrainian soldiers, their blue and yellow insignias catching the fading light. Alexei froze, his breath caught in his throat. They were moving in formation, scanning the area with practiced precision. Retreat was not an option. Any movement would draw their attention. He gripped his rifle, weighing his options. For a brief moment, Alexei considered fighting. He could engage, take cover, and try to hold them off long enough to escape. But deep down he knew the futility of resistance. He was outnumbered, outgunned, and alone. His mind raced with thoughts of his family, of the life he might still cling to if he made it through this. The weight of his decisions, of the war itself, pressed down on him. Slowly he stood, raising his hands above his head, his rifle dangling from his shoulder. The Ukrainian soldiers approached cautiously, their weapons trained on him. "Drop the weapon," one of them shouted. Alexei complied, lowering his rifle to the ground and stepping back. The soldiers encircled him, their faces a mix of suspicion and disdain. One of them barked orders into a radio, and within minutes, Alexei was blindfolded and escorted to a makeshift detention center. In his later account, Alexei described his surrender as a calculated move, a decision made to preserve his life and avoid unnecessary bloodshed. "There was no point in fighting," he said. "I wasn't going to throw my life away for nothing." But the interviewer's probing revealed another layer to his actions.
Bitte make that. Like the eater, the cost, but the internet phones, what, host chess, JR, opposition, but didn't say.
Seen the Tuka. So 1800s, I've seen the tide, I've seen the tech sucker. Alexei had seen the tide and you were saying, Versus you cider. Ali seen the G, said. Alexei, Shanto, Sadal Kolokio, to use or you had to use. At a dinty glass to serious. At a capia pocket also empties on the jet house at called having good television in the year. The tactical decisions that led him to that moment, his choice to separate from his men, to abandon the mission, to raise his hands instead of his rifle, painted a picture of a man caught between duty and desperation, and as he was led away from the battlefield, the echoes of his decisions lingered in the silence, a testament to the moral weight of war. The room was bare, save for a single metal table and 2 chairs under the harsh glare of a fluorescent bulb. Alexei Komolov sat with his hands clasped in front of him, his eyes scanning the room as if searching for anything to anchor himself. Across from him sat the Ukrainian interrogator, a composed figure with sharp eyes that seemed to cut through Alexei's every word. The conversation began with pleasantries, a disarming civility that put Alexei at ease. For a moment, Major Komolov, the interrogator, said, flipping open a notebook. Let's start with the basics. Name, rank, and unit. Alexei recited his details with the precision of a soldier, but his voice faltered slightly when he added, I'm just a reconnaissance officer. My role was intelligence gathering, nothing more. The interrogator raised an eyebrow, the first crack in the mask of formality. Nothing more. Major, your reports pinpointed civilian infrastructure as potential threats. Bridges, evacuation routes, even water stations. Are you saying you didn't know these would be targeted? Alexei shifted uncomfortably in his chair. We identified potential military uses of those sites, he explained. It wasn't my decision to strike them. I was just following orders. Following orders, the interrogator repeated, leaning forward. You provided the coordinates, didn't you? Without your intelligence, those strikes wouldn't have been possible. Do you think that absolves you? The question hung in the air, and Alexei hesitated. I was doing my job, he said finally, his tone defensive. It's not my fault if others made decisions based on my reports. The interrogator flipped to another page in the notebook. Let's talk about the Kakhovka Dam, they said. Alexei's expression hardened, but he said nothing. Your unit was active in that region. You filed intelligence reports highlighting the dam's strategic importance. Weeks later, it was destroyed, flooding villages and killing civilians. What do you have to say about that? I wasn't there when it happened, Alexei replied quickly. We had already moved out of the area. I only heard about it afterward. The interrogator's gaze remained steady. Convenient, isn't it? You provide intelligence, the dam is destroyed, and thousands suffer, but you're nowhere to be found. Do you understand how that looks? I didn't order the strike, Alexei snapped, his composure momentarily breaking. I didn't know it would happen. I was following protocol, nothing more. The interrogator leaned back, their tone now measured but firm. Protocol doesn't erase the consequences, Major. You were part of an occupying force that terrorized civilians. You provided the information that made it possible. Do you really believe you bear no responsibility? Alexei's eyes darted to the table. I had no choice, he muttered. If I refused, I would have been court-martialed. What would you have done in my position? The interrogator's voice sharpened. I wouldn't have participated in war crimes, and I certainly wouldn't sit here pretending I'm blameless. They let the words sink in before continuing. You speak of having no choice, but you chose to stay. You chose to follow orders, knowing the harm they caused. Alexei's silence was deafening. He stared at the table, his shoulders slumping slightly. The interrogator seized the moment. Major, you've told us about your chain of command, your orders, your protocols. But where is your conscience in all of this? Did you ever question what you were doing? For a moment, it seemed as though Alexei might respond, but he remained silent, his jaw tightening. The interrogator sighed, their tone softening slightly. You're not the first to claim innocence, and you won't be the last. But understand this. History will not remember your excuses you made, and the lives those choices destroyed. The session ended with Alexei escorted back to his cell, his mind replaying the conversation. For all his justifications, the interrogator's questions lingered, unrelenting. In that stark room, stripped of rank and pretense, Major Alexei Komolov was no longer just a soldier. He was a man grappling with the weight of his actions and the inescapable truth of his complicity. The interrogator returned the next day, their demeanor unchanged but their approach sharper. By now, they had dissected Alexei Komolov's accounts, finding the inconsistencies that unraveled his carefully constructed narrative. The session began like the others, but it didn't take long for the cracks in Alexei's story to widen. You mentioned yesterday that your role was limited to intelligence gathering. The interrogator started, their voice calm but firm, that you avoided civilian interaction to respect their boundaries. But in another instance, you said your unit provided food and water to displaced families. Which is it, Major? Were you distant, or were you involved? Alexei hesitated, searching for an answer. We avoided unnecessary interactions, he said carefully. But there were times when we couldn't ignore their needs. Basic humanity. Humanity? The interrogator echoed, flipping through their notes. Interesting, because earlier you claimed you had no control over outcomes, that you were just following orders. But helping civilians, was that an order, or was it a choice? Caught off guard, Alexei fumbled. It was situational, he muttered. We did what we could when the opportunity allowed. The interrogator pounced. Situational humanity, then? You followed orders to mark evacuation routes and bridges that were later destroyed, but you drew the line at ignoring a hungry child. Help me understand, Major. How do you decide when to follow orders and when to act on your humanity? Alexei's silence was deafening. The contradiction was laid bare. His selective morality, invoked when convenient, shattered under scrutiny. The interrogator leaned in, their tone cutting. You can't claim to be a helpless pawn in one breath and a compassionate soldier in the next. Pick a side. The conversation shifted to the Kakhovka Dam. Alexei repeated his denial of involvement, his insistence that he was long gone when the dam was destroyed. I didn't even know it was a target, he said firmly. But your unit identified it as a strategic site, the interrogator countered. You knew the consequences of flooding that area. Yet, you filed that report. Why? It was protocol, Alexei replied quickly. We had to note all significant infrastructure. The interrogator's eyes narrowed. So, it was just protocol to enable the destruction of villages, the displacement of families, and the deaths of civilians. You reported it knowing what could happen. Don't hide behind protocol, Major. Own it. Alexei's face reddened, and he raised his voice. I didn't make the decision. That was command. I didn't know they'd go that far. The interrogator's voice grew colder. Then why didn't you question it? If you knew there was a risk, why didn't you push back? Or were you too focused on self-preservation? The inconsistencies piled up. When asked about his presence in Melitopol, Alexei claimed his unit's missions were limited to surveillance. But the interrogator produced evidence of artillery strikes that followed his reports. Your intelligence paved the way for shelling civilian areas, they stated. You say you didn't pull the trigger, but you gave them the target. Isn't that the same thing? Alexei bristled. I didn't choose those targets. I was following orders. Following orders, the interrogator repeated, the words laced with disdain. It's always the same excuse. But let me ask you this. When you followed orders to mark those sites, did you ever stop to think about the people living there? Did you ever ask yourself if it was right? Alexei opened his mouth to respond, but closed it again, his words failing him. The interrogator's relentless questioning had left him cornered, his narrative of duty and helplessness unraveling. You talk about orders, but orders don't erase consequences. They don't absolve you of responsibility. The interrogator pressed. Your reports caused harm, Major. No amount of denial will change that. By the end of the session, Alexei's composure had eroded. His confident assertions of innocence gave way to defensive stammering and awkward silences. The contradictions in his account, his claimed ignorance, selective morality, and reliance on orders as justification, had been laid bare. For every justification he offered, the interrogator revealed its flaw, exposing the moral vacuum at the center of his actions. As Alexei was led back to his cell, he carried with him the weight of his unraveling story. His claims of humanity and duty, once his shield, had crumbled under the interrogator's sharp scrutiny. What remained was the undeniable truth of his complicity, etched not only in the evidence but in the fractures of his own words. Alexei Komolov leaned forward in his chair, his voice steady but strained. I am not a monster, he said, the words hanging heavily in the air. I didn't want to hurt anyone. I'm a decent man, a father. I did what I had to do because there was no other choice. From the outset, Alexei's defense was built around his humanity. He spoke often of his family back in Penza, a wife, 2 young daughters, and aging parents. He described himself as a man caught in circumstances beyond his control, thrust into a war he did not choose. "I was a soldier," he said, his tone insistent. "Not a killer. I didn't want to be in Ukraine, but I had no say in the matter. Orders are orders." Yet, his words betrayed a man attempting to construct a moral high ground amid the ruins of his actions. For every assertion of decency, there was a counterweight, the undeniable evidence of his complicity. When pressed about the destruction of the Kakhovka Dam, Alexei deflected. "I didn't cause that," he argued. "I wasn't even there." But his reconnaissance reports, which highlighted the dam as a strategic site, told a different story. Without those reports, the targeting of the dam might not have been possible. "I tried to do the right thing when I could." Alexei insisted, recounting moments where he claimed to have acted with humanity. He spoke of ordering his men to distribute food and water to displaced civilians in Kherson. He described how he avoided confrontations with local residents, framing these choices as evidence of his decency. "I told my men to show respect," he said. "We weren't there to harm people. We were there to maintain order." But the interrogator, ever precise, dismantled these claims piece by piece. "You say you weren't there to harm anyone," they began, "but your reports paved the way for strikes on civilian infrastructure. Bridges, factories, even residential areas. How do you reconcile that with your humanity?" Alexei faltered. "I didn't make those decisions," he replied, his voice defensive. "I just followed orders. I wasn't in a position to question them." "Did you ever try?" the interrogator shot back. "Did you ever speak up, even once, about the consequences of your actions?" Alexei's silence was deafening. The interrogator pressed further, citing his presence in Melitopol, where his intelligence led to the heavy shelling of industrial zones and residential blocks. "You claim you avoided civilian interaction to respect their boundaries," they said, "but your reports turned their homes into targets. How do you justify that?" "I didn't know they would target those areas," Alexei protested. "I assumed they were legitimate military objectives." "You assumed," the interrogator repeated, their tone sharp. "Did you ever stop to think about what that assumption cost?" Lives were lost, families were displaced, and communities were destroyed. All because you assumed. Does that sound like the actions of a decent man? The contradictions in Alexei's narrative became glaring. He spoke of humanity, but relied on the impersonal machinery of war to absolve himself. He framed his choices as reluctant, but made no effort to resist the system he claimed to despise. For every claim of decency, there was a shadow, an action or inaction that undermined his defense. At one point, Alexei's voice cracked as he spoke of the guilt he felt when hearing of the destruction his reports had enabled. "I didn't want any of this," he said quietly. "I just wanted to survive, to go home to my family." But the interrogator's response was unyielding. "And what about the families who lost everything because of you? What about the children who didn't get to see their parents again? Survival isn't an excuse for complicity, Major." By the end of the session, Alexei's narrative of humanity lay in tatters. His words, once steady and assured, now wavered under the weight of evidence. The interrogator's questions had exposed the gap between his self-image and the reality of his actions, a gap filled with the lives and livelihoods destroyed by the choices he made. In his attempts to assert his decency, Alexei Komolov revealed the deeper truth of his complicity. His humanity, it seemed, was not absent, but it was fractured, buried beneath the wreckage of war and the orders he chose to follow. Alexei Komolov sat stiffly across from the interrogator, his face betraying a mixture of defiance and discomfort. He had been through multiple sessions by now, each one peeling back another layer of his carefully crafted narrative. The interrogator's approach remained deliberate, their questions precise and unrelenting, aimed at revealing the contradictions and moral blind spots Alexei so desperately tried to conceal. The interrogator began with a direct question. "When you filed intelligence reports on evacuation routes and bridges, did you think about the civilians relying on them to escape?" Alexei hesitated, visibly taken aback. His response was quick but shallow, explaining that he was simply following orders and fulfilling his role as a reconnaissance officer. The interrogator's tone sharpened, exposing the evasion in his answer. "You saw those people. You knew what those routes meant to them. Yet, you still marked them for destruction. Was your duty to your orders more important than their lives?" Alexei shifted in his seat, his voice lowering as he tried to justify his actions. The interrogator, unflinching, pointed out the broader implications of his choices. "You talk about duty, but duty is not a shield against morality. At what point did you stop questioning the consequences of your actions?" The words struck hard, their weight sinking into the room. Alexei's reply was vague, blaming the chain of command and claiming ignorance of the specific outcomes. The interrogator pressed further, addressing Alexei's denial of involvement in the Kakhovka Dam destruction. You've said repeatedly that you had no knowledge of plans to target the dam, but your unit's intelligence reports highlighted its strategic importance. How can you claim ignorance when your own work made the attack possible? Alexei responded defensively, insisting he had moved out of the area before the incident occurred. The interrogator did not relent, countering that proximity was irrelevant when his actions had already set events into motion. You left the area, but your reports stayed. They were the blueprint for what followed. You knew the risks, yet you filed them anyway. As the conversation deepened, the interrogator shifted focus to Alexei's claims of humanity. He had emphasized his reluctance to harm civilians and pointed to isolated moments of compassion, such as distributing food to displaced families. The interrogator leaned in, their voice calm but cutting. You selectively applied your humanity when it suited you, but where was it when you marked evacuation routes for airstrikes? Where was it when you turned civilian infrastructure into military targets? Alexei struggled to respond, his words faltering. The interrogator seized the opportunity, turning to his broader justification of following orders. You speak of duty and protocol as if they absolve you, but orders don't erase accountability. Did you ever question what you were doing, or was survival all that mattered? The question lingered, heavy with implication. Alexei looked away, unable to meet their gaze. The interrogator's perspective was clear and unwavering. Alexei's moral blind spots were not accidental but deliberate choices. He had willingly suspended his humanity when it conflicted with his orders, prioritizing his survival and obedience over the lives of others. The interrogator summarized this point with precision. You say you had no choice, but choices are not always grand gestures of rebellion. They are the small moments when you decide to look the other way or to follow an order you know is wrong. You made those choices, Major. You chose to comply, and compliance has consequences. By the end of the session, Alexei sat in silence, his arguments dismantled and his evasions exposed. The interrogator had illuminated the gap between his narrative and reality, revealing the moral compromises that defined his actions. For every claim of innocence Alexei presented, the interrogator found its contradiction, laying bare the uncomfortable truths he could no longer escape. Alexei Komolov sat alone in his cell, his mind a torrent of fragmented memories and unspoken regrets. The interrogation sessions had left him raw, stripped of the certainty he once clung to as a soldier. He had entered the war in Ukraine with a sense of duty, a belief that he was fulfilling an obligation to his country. Yet now, with every passing day, that sense of duty felt more like a hollow excuse, a facade behind which he had hidden from the weight of his choices. In moments of quiet reflection, Alexei replayed the questions from the interrogator, their words cutting deeper than he cared to admit. They had forced him to confront the uncomfortable truths he had spent months trying to ignore. He thought about the bridges his unit had marked for destruction, the villages that had been reduced to rubble following his reconnaissance reports, and the civilians whose lives had been irreparably shattered. Each instance was a thread, and together they wove a tapestry of complicity he could no longer deny. Alexei's internal conflict was palpable. On one hand, he clung to the defense that he had only followed orders, that his role was limited to intelligence gathering. This narrative had been his shield, a way to justify his actions and protect himself from guilt. On the other hand, the interrogator's probing had planted a seed of doubt, a gnawing awareness that obedience did not absolve him. The more he tried to justify his decisions, the more hollow his arguments sounded, even to himself. In his mind, Alexei revisited his earliest days in Ukraine. He remembered the first reports he filed, detailing strategic sites and potential threats. At the time, he convinced himself that his work was clinical, detached from the human cost. But now, with the benefit of hindsight, he saw the faces of those who had suffered because of his decisions. The family stranded when a bridge was destroyed. The villagers swept away by the floodwaters of the Kakhovka Dam. The residents of Melitopol who lost their homes to artillery strikes. These were no longer abstract casualties. They were people whose lives intersected with his actions. The weight of responsibility bore down on him, pressing against his chest like a physical force. For the first time, Alexei began to question the values he had been raised with, the blind loyalty to authority, the belief that duty to the state outweighed all else. He thought of his father, a career officer who had always taught him that orders were sacred and unchallengeable. But had his father ever faced the moral quagmire Alexei now found himself in? Would he have made the same choices, or would he have chosen differently? Alexei's struggles extended beyond his actions in the war to his very identity. Who was he now, stripped of his rank and uniform, sitting in a foreign prison? He was no longer Major Komolov, the respected officer leading reconnaissance missions. He was a prisoner of war, accused of participating in an unjust invasion, grappling with the consequences of his compliance. The image he had of himself, as a man of honor, a protector of his family and country, was crumbling under the weight of reality. At times, Alexei tried to compartmentalize, to separate the man he believed himself to be from the actions he had taken. But the interrogator's words haunted him. Orders don't erase accountability. You chose to comply, and compliance has consequences. He realized that no matter how he framed his decisions, he could not escape their impact. His choices had caused pain, destruction, and loss, and no amount of justification could erase that. In the rare moments of clarity, Alexei considered what it meant to take responsibility. Could he admit to himself, let alone to others, that he bore some share of the blame? Or would he continue to shield himself with the defense of duty and survival? He wanted to believe he was a decent man, a victim of circumstance, but the evidence weighed heavily against him. Decency, he realized, was not defined by intention but by action, and his actions had left a trail of devastation. Alexei's struggle was not just about accepting guilt, it was about reconciling who he was with what he had done. It was about facing the dissonance between the soldier who had followed orders and the man who now saw the human cost of those orders. The journey to acceptance, he knew, would not be easy, and perhaps it would never be complete. But as he sat in the silence of his cell, the weight of responsibility was inescapable, a reminder that even in war, the choices we make define the legacy we leave behind. Alexei Komolov's first days in captivity were defined by a stark contrast to the life he had known as a soldier. The rigidity of military discipline was replaced by the monotony of confinement. Stripped of his rank, his weapon, and the structured authority of his unit, he found himself reduced to a single identity: prisoner. The walls of his cell were bare, the silence punctuated only by the footsteps of guards and the occasional muffled voices of other detainees. For Alexei, this new existence was both humbling and disorienting. In the beginning, Alexei maintained a stoic demeanor, drawing on his military training to endure the physical and psychological challenges of captivity. He adhered to a strict routine, performing exercises in the small space of his cell and keeping his thoughts focused on the hope of eventual release. But as days turned into weeks, the isolation began to take its toll. Without the structure of military life or the camaraderie of his men, he was left alone with his thoughts, an endless loop of second-guessing and regret. His moments of vulnerability became more frequent, particularly in the quiet hours of the night. The interrogations had shaken him, forcing him to confront questions he had long avoided. He found himself replaying the events that led to his capture, the decisions he had made, and the lives his actions had affected. The weight of responsibility, coupled with the uncertainty of his future, created an emotional burden that even his disciplined exterior could not mask. Alexei's longing for connection grew stronger with each passing day. In one of his few opportunities to communicate beyond the walls of his cell, he requested to speak with his father. It was a deeply personal plea, one that revealed his need for validation and reassurance. His father, a retired military officer, had always been a figure of authority and guidance in his life. Alexei hoped that hearing his father's voice might anchor him, provide a sense of purpose, or at least ease the growing doubts about his choices. When the opportunity came, the conversation was brief and strained. His father's voice carried a mix of disappointment and sadness, a tone Alexei had never heard before. While his father did not openly criticize him, the silence between his words spoke volumes. Alexei tried to explain himself, to justify his actions as part of his duty, but his father offered little in return. It was a conversation that left Alexei feeling more adrift than before, as if the very foundation of his identity had shifted. Life in captivity also brought moments of unexpected humanity. Alexei observed small acts of kindness from his captors, gestures that reminded him of the shared humanity often obscured by war. A guard who offered him an extra piece of bread, a medic who ensured he received treatment for a lingering injury. These moments, though fleeting, stood in stark contrast to the narratives of animosity he had carried into the war. They left Alexei questioning the lines that divided enemy from ally, captor from prisoner. Yet these moments of clarity were often fleeting. The reality of captivity was harsh and unrelenting. Alexei struggled to adapt to the loss of autonomy, the monotony of his daily existence, and the gnawing uncertainty about what lay ahead. Each day blurred into the next, marked only by the rare breaks in routine, interrogations, brief exchanges with guards, and the occasional sliver of news from the outside world. As weeks turned into months, Alexei began to accept the fragility of his situation. His stoicism gave way to a quieter resilience, a recognition that survival now depended not on brute strength or discipline, but on patience and reflection. He still held on to the hope of returning home, but he also understood that the journey back, if it ever came, would require more than endurance. It would require confronting the choices that had led him to this point, and the identity he had built around those choices. In the silence of his cell, Alexei Komolov faced his most difficult battle, not against an enemy, but within himself. Captivity stripped away the external markers of who he was, leaving him to grapple with the person he had become. And as he navigated the emotional and physical toll of this new reality, he realized that the path to redemption, if it existed, would begin not with excuses or justifications, but with an honest reckoning of his actions and their consequences. In the stillness of his cell, Alexei Komolov often spoke in low, measured tones, reflecting on the war that had brought him to this point. He recounted the early days of his deployment with a mixture of detachment and weariness, his words betraying a deepening ambivalence about the purpose of it all. What had once been framed as a noble mission to protect Russian interests and secure borders now felt, even to him, like an exercise in futility and destruction. "The things we were told before crossing the border," he began, his voice faltering. "They made it sound like we were there to help, to liberate. But the truth is, when you're on the ground, nothing feels like liberation. It's just chaos. It's survival." As Alexei spoke, his words revealed glimpses of a man wrestling with the contradictions of his role. He described the devastation he had witnessed in towns like Melitopol and Kherson, the empty streets, the crumbled buildings, the faces of civilians who watched him and his men with a mixture of fear and defiance. "We were told they would welcome us," he said quietly, his tone tinged with regret. "But they didn't. How could they? We brought destruction, not peace." Despite these admissions, Alexei's reflections often seemed to skirt the edges of accountability. He spoke of the suffering he saw, but rarely of the suffering he caused. When pressed, he deflected, returning to the refrain that had become his mantra: "I was following orders. What could I have done?" His words carried a trace of sincerity, but also a lingering sense of denial, a refusal to fully confront the role he had played in the very destruction he now lamented. At times, Alexei's reflections turned inward, revealing the toll the war had taken on his own psyche. He spoke of sleepless nights and the constant weight of fear, both on the battlefield and now in captivity. "War changes you," he said. "It strips away everything you thought you knew about yourself. You do things you never imagined you were capable of, and then you spend every moment after trying to forget them." These moments of vulnerability were striking, yet they often left room for skepticism. While Alexei appeared genuine in his anguish, there was a calculated nature to his words, as if he was carefully crafting a narrative to absolve himself. He painted himself as a victim of circumstance, a soldier caught in the machinery of war, but he rarely acknowledged the choices he made within that machinery. His reflections on the war's impact on him overshadowed the devastation it wrought on others, leaving an unsettling imbalance in his perspective. One of the most revealing moments came when Alexei spoke about his family. "I think about my daughters every day," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "I wonder what they'll think of me when they're old enough to understand. Will they see me as a protector, or will they see me as a protector, or will they see me as something else?" It was a rare moment of introspection, one that hinted at his awareness of the moral weight he carried. Yet, even here, Alexei's focus remained inward, centered on his own pain rather than the pain he had inflicted. The contradictions in Alexei's reflections were impossible to ignore. On one hand, he seemed genuinely haunted by the war, grappling with the memories of what he had seen and done. On the other hand, his reluctance to fully accept responsibility left his sincerity open to question. Was he truly reckoning with his role in the conflict, or was he merely seeking to reframe himself as a victim rather than a perpetrator? For viewers, Alexei's reflections serve as a window into the complexities of a soldier's psyche, but also as a reminder of the ways self-perception can distort accountability. His words, filled with regret and justification, invite sympathy, but also demand scrutiny. They force us to ask difficult questions. Is Alexei Komolov a man overwhelmed by the horrors of war, or is he a man desperately trying to escape the consequences of his actions? Perhaps he is both, and perhaps that duality is the most unsettling truth of all. Alexei Komolov often sat in the dim light of his cell, his thoughts circling the same unanswerable questions. The war, which had once seemed so distant and abstract, had now consumed his life, leaving behind ruins, both in the world and within himself. His reflections on the cost of war were fragmented, incomplete, but they carried the weight of someone who had lived its realities in the most personal and devastating ways. He spoke about the faces that lingered in his memory, the civilians in Kherson staring silently as his convoy passed, the soldiers under his command who had looked to him for leadership, and the children who clutched their parents in fear as explosions echoed through their towns. He described the emptiness of those moments, the deep and gnawing sense that something irrevocable had been lost. The war, he admitted, had taken everything from them, from him, from everyone it touched. It had left no winners, only survivors. As he reflected on his actions, Alexei struggled to define what it meant to serve. He had grown up believing that duty was paramount, that loyalty to one's country was the highest calling. But that belief now felt hollow in the face of the destruction he had witnessed and enabled. The ideals he once held so tightly seemed incompatible with the choices he had made. In his quieter moments, Alexei wondered if the uniform he wore had protected him from accountability, or if it had simply masked the humanity he had spent years trying to preserve. The interrogations had forced him to confront these contradictions, and the weight of his decisions was inescapable. He understood now that orders, no matter how absolute they seemed, could not erase the consequences of his actions. Each destroyed bridge, each ruined town, each life lost had left a mark on him as much as on those who suffered directly. The war, he realized, had demanded not just the sacrifice of others, but the slow erosion of his own sense of self. Alexei's thoughts often turned to his family, imagining the conversations he might one day have with his daughters. What would he tell them about the war? How could he explain his decisions, his failures, his complicity? Would they see him as a man who did his best in impossible circumstances, or as someone who lacked the courage to resist? The questions haunted him, and their answers remained just out of reach. The war had taken lives, homes, and futures. It had also taken something intangible: trust, humanity, and the shared understanding of what is right and wrong. For Alexei, the cost of war was not just measured in the destruction it left behind, but in the moral reckoning it demanded. He had lived through it, contributed to it, and now he was left to grapple with what it had made him. As viewers consider Alexei's story, they are left with their own questions. How do we define accountability in the context of war? Is following orders a justification, or is it a failure to act with moral courage? Can a person's humanity survive when they are part of a system designed to destroy? Alexei Komolov's journey offers no easy answers, only the uncomfortable reminder that in war, the lines between victim, perpetrator, and survivor blur, leaving behind the undeniable truth that no one emerges untouched. The choices made on the battlefield ripple far beyond it, shaping not just the course of history, but the very fabric of humanity itself. Alexei Komolov's story is more than a chronicle of a soldier's journey through war. It is a window into the moral cost of conflict, a narrative that forces us to confront the human complexities behind the uniforms and the battle lines. From his upbringing in a military household to his role in the war, and finally, to his life in captivity, Alexei's experiences reveal the heavy price of obedience and the weight of choices made under orders. The recurring theme throughout Alexei's account is his struggle to balance duty with humanity. He speaks of following orders, of doing what was required of him as a soldier, but the outcomes of those actions paint a darker picture. Civilian infrastructure destroyed. Families displaced, lives lost. These were not just collateral damage, but direct consequences of the decisions he justified under the banner of duty. Alexei's claims of being a decent man caught in a situation beyond his control are difficult to reconcile with the evidence of his complicity. His story forces us to ask, at what point does loyalty to authority become a betrayal of moral responsibility? Accountability in war is a challenging subject, one that touches not just soldiers but also the systems that demand and enforce their obedience. Alexei's journey highlights the tension between individual agency and institutional power, raising questions about whether soldiers have the capacity or the courage to resist when orders contradict their sense of right and wrong. His narrative challenges us to consider the broader implications of conflict, where the line between victim and perpetrator blurs, and where humanity often seems like the first casualty. But Alexei's story is not unique. His experiences echo those of countless others who find themselves caught in the machinery of war, navigating the impossible choices it forces upon them. His struggle with guilt and responsibility mirrors the larger moral dilemmas faced by soldiers on all sides of a conflict. It is a story of survival, but also of loss. Not just the loss of lives and communities, but the erosion of identity and values in the face of relentless violence. For viewers, Alexei's account is a call to reflect on the deeper truths of war. It is an invitation to question how we as societies hold individuals and systems accountable for the harm inflicted during conflict. Can a soldier be both a victim and a perpetrator? How do we navigate the gray areas of morality in war, where survival and duty often overshadow conscience? And most importantly, what lessons can we learn to prevent such tragedies from repeating? As we close this chapter, we invite you to think about Alexei's journey and what it reveals about the nature of war and humanity. How do you view his struggle to reconcile his actions with his sense of self? Can we truly separate individual responsibility from the systems that drive conflict? Your perspective matters, and we encourage you to share your thoughts in the comments. Alexei's story is just one of many. In our next video, we will explore the accounts of other prisoners of war, examining how their narratives align or diverge from his. Their voices, like his, are crucial to understanding the full scope of the human cost of conflict. Together, these stories create a tapestry of experiences that challenge us to see beyond the headlines and confront the realities of war. If you've been moved by this story, consider subscribing to our channel. Each video we share aims to shed light on the human truths behind the chaos of war, giving voice to those who have lived its realities. Don't miss the next chapter, where we continue to delve into the lives shaped and shattered by conflict. The journey to understanding is ongoing, and we hope you'll join us as we uncover more voices and more truths from the shadows of war. Together, we can seek the accountability and humanity that these stories demand.